As you assess resource concerns on rangeland, you'll see rangeland health mentioned as a go-to assessment tool. The rangeland health tool provides a framework to evaluate the degree of departure the site has from the historic climax plant community detailed on the ecological site description. The thought is that when a site is in its climax plant community, soil function, the water cycle, and the biotic interactions of the plant community are very healthy. The rangeland health assessment will ask you to provide qualitative and quantitative measurements for 17 indicators. The reference sheet for the ecological site description will provide your baseline for comparison. Departure from the historic climax condition is defined as none to slight, slight to moderate, moderate, moderate to extreme, and extreme. Extreme would mean that the site is greatly changed and likely degraded as compared to the reference state. Overall, rangeland health is meant to serve as an early warning system to help managers identify problem areas that warrant closer investigation. A good time to complete rangeland health assessments is when you're doing your initial resource inventory. Key grazing locations on dominant ecological sites are good locations to complete the assessment. Now, let's go down to ground level and discuss the evaluation of the 17 indicators on an actual site. Okay, so what we're going to do this afternoon is show you a little bit of a field demonstration on how to do a range health assessment. The first step that we're going to talk about is identifying the site. So if you look out past me here, you can see that we've got pretty consistent vegetation, at least to that wood line back there. And we've looked at our soil map before we came out. And then I like to use this the soil web page on our phones if you have service, and identify what soil you're on, and then we start digging holes to see if they match up and the vegetation matches up to the ecological site. It's going to be really important because you're going to need the right reference sheet for the site that you're on. So looking at the soil here, this is mapped, basically correlates to a soil we call arenosa, which is a very deep sand. You can see I've got a shovel slice here, and with this shovel slice I'm looking to see if this structure matches what's in the official series description from a depth, color, and structure standpoint. And this is kind of a unique example here because there's a lot of single grain structure in this sand, and it's super deep. So we didn't have anything out of the norm in our shovel slice here. Matches what we thought. And then with these deep sands, the depth of the sand is a big driver on what the site is. So we took our auger here, and you can see we went way down in a hurry, and didn't hit anything but sand here in this pile, so we feel really good about the site we're on. Okay, so the next step is we're going to walk through and actually do the assessment. And so with range health, you've got 17 different indicators that you're going to look at, and all the 17 indicators go towards three categories of range health that they call attributes. That's soil site stability, hydrologic function, and biotic integrity. The first indicator we'll look at is rills. Now this is a sandy soil with rapid permeability and rapid infiltration rates, so probably won't see a lot, but the way I would look at that is I would come down here on the ground, and what I'm looking for on a rill is a linear feature that runs along the ground where the water has a concentrated flow. Think of like a mini gully is what you might see. On this one there's no indication of rills for what we're seeing, but a rill could be an inch wide, and there's an upper size limit. I can't remember if it's a foot or two wide, but they can be pretty good size on some soils that have some natural erosion to them. Indicator number 2 is water flow patterns, and so what you're looking at for this indicator is to see if you're seeing an excessive amount of sheet erosion happening, or where that water's coming across the top and maybe transporting and moving excessive amounts of sediment. So as you see on this soil here, there's very little of that happening due to the high infiltration rates and the amount of cover. But if you had some issues with crusting or compaction, that might also manifest itself in those water flow patterns. It would be indicating reduced infiltration rates. All right, so indicator number 3 is pedestals or terracettes, and what we're looking for is plant pedestaling, where soil has washed out away from the base of the plant, or it may be more a larger feature where it's almost left a little ridge there from that water moving. And again, you know, this sandy site, you really have to hunt for it, but you can start to see a little bit of soil movement that's occurred around this plant here. Now, this particular site's been burned about 2 years ago, and so you don't see the cover you normally would. But I'm looking here, and all these edges are rounded, and none of them are recent. They're well stabilized. There's some crust on them. This again is well within the range of the site. But if you saw fresh cutting here and exposed roots or something like that, then you would probably have some potential pedestaling that you'd want to indicate. But you know, back to you want to look at your reference sheet and see what's normal for the site. I want to be sure to make that point. Okay, indicator number 4 is bare ground. This one is simple to capture, and I think other people can understand it and relate to it easily. The first thing you need to do is decide how you're going to measure it. You can do a line point intercept like you see in this video, a step point transect like you'll see when we talk about litter, or simply estimate the percent bare ground as you're clipping plots for the 802 form. Bare ground is defined as the surface area of the soil that's not covered by vegetation, both canopies and bases, not covered by litter, not covered by rock greater than 5 millimeters or more in diameter, and not covered by biological soil crusts. It's a good idea to also measure the percent litter cover as you measure bare ground, because you'll need that number later when you get to that indicator. Another point I'll make is that you have to interpret each data point you take carefully. Sometimes you can hit very minor amounts of standing dead stems of grass or other plants that has bare ground underneath it. In this situation, the small stems don't have much effect on raindrop impact or shading to regulate soil surface temperature. That's exactly what you're seeing on this site. When we counted every possible standing plant part, no matter the size, on our line transect, we came out to about 7% bare ground. When we looked at the function of these small standing dead stems and were more liberal with our identification of bare ground, we measured 21% bare ground. After we estimated bare ground on our 802 clipping, we also came up with a number between 20 and 22% bare ground. We think that number is a much better characterization of this particular site. I think the message here is that you want to take a step back and make sure your data makes sense and characterizes the site as best able. Okay, so you just got a little bit of a look at the ground as Brandon brought the camera across there, and you can see that this site naturally has some bare ground to it. But your next indicator you're looking for is gullies. Now, obviously, you didn't see any right there. This site has good cover for its capacity to do so. But with gullies, obviously, you're looking for a large erosion feature. And so if you had cattle trailing or roads or that sort of thing that are unimproved, that might be somewhere that something like that would start. So as you're doing your inventory across the whole property, you would want to look for those sites and see if you have any of those features. But in this instance, we're well within the range, and gullies would be very abnormal for this site. Okay, your next indicator is another erosion feature, and that's wind scoured or deposition areas. And so you're looking for soil movement there driven by wind. So where we're at here in this part of the state, we're looking at about 42 inches of rain a year in this county, long growing season, and so lots of vegetation. So even if you don't have perennials, it wants to cover up an annual vegetation. So it's hard to have the soil bare enough, long enough, unless you went in there and did some sort of severe disturbance. And then we really don't get those real high wind patterns like you might in West Texas or parts of South Texas here. So it's hard to get that feature, but you'd be looking for soil movement piling up on plants right here. And with one of these deep sands, in an extreme case, you'd even have like some active dunes. And that does happen in parts of the state. So that's something to look for when you're on a deep sand. Most of your heavier soils, it'd be rare to find that feature. But as you work in your counties and become aware of your climate and where the potential risks for erosion in your county are, you'll be very aware of where those areas to watch for it would be. Indicator number 7 is litter movement. So what this indicator is looking at is the size and amount and distance that litter is moved compared to what's normal for the site. So like on this site, I've got a little bit of leaf litter here that's probably blown in, and then some grass litter and some old duff right here, but we're seeing very little movement. But if there was accumulating a long distance away, washed clean, that would be something that you would look at to see if it might be a departure from what's normal for the site. Okay, indicator number 8 is soil surface resistance to erosion. And so on this assessment, you'll consider the interspaces between the plants and the plant canopy and take that into consideration. But then a good way to measure this indicator is with aggregate stability. And so to do this, you'll want to find an area and randomly collect about a dozen different heads from the soil surface. And then the kit will give you these little cups to put them in and a tool to cut an aggregate with. And you come down here, and it's kind of challenging to do on this soil, but you will cut out a little aggregate from the surface of the soil and place it in this cup. And then we'll take this and we'll put it in water back at the truck under a certain protocol, and it essentially works like a slake test to see how stable the aggregate is. So I'll show you that back at the truck. Okay, so here we've got the aggregate stability kit back at the truck, and we've got our aggregates we collected. You take these aggregates and we'll immerse them in distilled water and see how they hold together. And again, you would have several samples, and you leave them in that water for 5 minutes. The instructions are right on the lid of the kit, and how quickly they break apart, like we had one just break right there, is how you will rate them. So the higher the number, the more stable. But we had one that pretty much fell apart within the first 30 seconds. But if we were to speed up and you had 5 minutes afterwards, then you'll pick them up, and I believe you do a few dipping cycles and see what's left. And so like that particular aggregate went pretty low. I believe it would have been in that first category probably, but the other one's looking a lot better. Okay, indicator number 9 is soil surface loss and degradation. And what we're going to do is come back to our shovel slice and see if the A horizon matches pretty close to what is in the official series description. And so again, this soil is pretty challenging to work with because there's not a lot of structure development. There's not any increase in clay as you go down, but I feel pretty good that our A horizon is somewhere right in here at 3 to 4 inches, and looking at that series description, it matches it well. Indicator number 10 is the effects of plant community composition and distribution relative to infiltration. So what I'm going to do for this one is make sure I've walked across this site and see what the plant community looks like. And so if you take a look at what's here, you'll see several bunch grasses, little blue stem dominated. You'll see a woody component of blue jack oak and some hickory there. You'll see some bare ground, but you'll see some of these mid grasses mixed in here as well. This matches very closely with the ecological site description for the reference plant community. So even though it's not completely covered, it's within the range for the site, and we would think that infiltration and there wouldn't be any issues with infiltration rates or excessive runoff. Indicator number 11 is compaction layer. So you're going to look in that soil profile and see if you see any evidence of compaction. So you can take your shovel, and in this soil it's very easy to dig down. Now don't be confused by this crust that you see here, but you're going to look at the structure of the soil, and luckily I'm getting a few aggregates here, but you're looking for platy structure where it looks like plates stacked on top of each other. that could be from compaction, or you're looking for a degradation of structure where you have much larger aggregates than what's normal for the site. Indicator 12 is functional structural groups. And what they're talking about there are these different groups of plants that fill a similar role on the site. And they've recently expanded the question on the range health assessment to 4 different components, and that's the dominance of each group, the number of groups not expected that are present, the number of groups overall, and the number of species within each group. So now, like, I'll give you an example of functional structural groups that would be on this site. One would be the tall grasses, like this little blue stem here, and then a midgrass would be this 3-on that we have. The woody plants would be their own functional structural group, and then you have a number of forbs that are out here as well. But the dominant functional structural group for this site currently is these tall grasses, and that's what matches the description. Indicator 13 is dead or dying plants and plant parts. So when you're looking across the site and noticing all the different plants you have, you're looking to see if there's an excessive amount of dead plants, or the leaves are yellowing and unhealthy, you know, like there's part of the plant that's dead or fixing to die. But you also want to take into account like past management that's occurred. You know, this oak here has been top killed, and then you can see some more skeletons in here, but you can see the vigorous regrowth that's coming back of the woody species here. So on this particular site, there's no issues with dead or dying plant parts, but you want to consider those conditions, and you know, especially if you've had like excessively dry conditions or something like that, or even flooding. Indicator 14 is percent litter cover and amount compared to what's normal for the site. So a quick way to do that might just be to take a step transect if you haven't already done a tape. And what I might do is just take 3 steps, and then at the corner of my boot, see if there's litter there and how big it is, so I get an idea for the percent cover. So every 3rd step, you know, I'll look and see if there's litter or not, and then another one, so on and so forth, until I get, you know, 20 or 50, just however much time you have to put into it to see what the litter amount says. And on the reference sheet, it'll tell you what to expect for the site. Indicator number 15 is annual production as compared to what is expected for the site. And so with range healths, they're talking about total production, including forbs and woodies and whatnot. Generally, we get a good estimate of that when we're filling out an 802 form for forage standpoint. And so you put down a frame of a known size, and then you might clip weight units. Like this is my weight unit of little blue stem that I pulled all of last year's growth out. And then you're essentially double sampling. I've weighed this weight unit, and then I'm using it to count how many of them are in this plot. And we'll turn that back to pounds per acre for the site. And that question on the form is asking, you know, it actually wants to know the ratio of what you actually have versus what's expected for the site. Indicator number 16 is about invasive plants and how many invasive plants you have for the site. Now they're talking about plants here that act as invaders, not necessarily just invasive plants that are on the Texas Department of Agriculture invasive species list. So it could be a normal plant like mesquite, or in this case it might be, you know, some of these oaks that we have here and hickories. But as you look across this site, earlier we stretched the tape across it to measure the canopy, and we came up with about 20% woody canopy across that area over there, and that's well within how much woody canopy would be here. And what they're asking about, just as a little reminder there, is the percent of those invader type plants as compared to the historic plant community. And so that'll be the first plant community described in the ecological site description. The final indicator, or indicator 17, is Vigor with an emphasis on reproductive capability of perennial plants. And so as you go across the site and look at the plants that are growing there, you're looking to see if there's new plants that are being recruited, older plants there, and just overall plant health, that there's a good distribution of age out there, and then that there's not a lot of decadent or dead plants. And so this plant right here might, if you had a bunch of these all over the site, that might give you some concerns about vigor. But on this site that we're looking at, almost all these plants, you can see last year's growth sticking up here, but all the new green growth coming up through us doesn't give us any concern for the amount of vigor that they have. Okay, now that we've done the field work here, I want to go over the data sheets and some of the supporting materials for range health real quick for you guys. So the first thing I want to say is this handbook, version 5, has a lot of detail in there, and I breezed through those 17 indicators pretty fast and just gave 1 or 2 pointers on some of those things. There's a lot more detail in the handbook that could fit your area better than what I went over it. So especially if you're brand new to it, I would encourage you to look at the detailed description of the indicators and how to evaluate them and fit it to your specific location. So I'm going to throw that out there. And then I want to show you the generic matrix for this handbook. All right, it even worked. So here it is. What this is a generic description for each indicator that talks about what the site might look like to describe different degrees of departures. So I'll show you, like on reels right here, extreme departure from the historic climax plant community would mean that reels are numerous and frequent throughout the site there. They're all wide, deep, long, so on and so forth. So you can see there's a description for the different ratings you could possibly give the indicator. And of course, none to slight, that matches the historic climax plant community. It should match what the reference sheet says, and you can see on none to slight, it talks about inserting the reference sheet narrative. The idea is that eventually a matrix would be available for each ecological site that is specific to that site to allow you to evaluate it. Now that hasn't happened yet. I think it's coming. I'm not 100% positive, but that's what these blanks mean here. So especially if you're brand new to range health, this is good to be aware of, and this is helpful to get started with. And then once you become more familiar with it, I think it's more intuitive, and you may not need to reference this document. Okay, so now let's go out to the summary sheet. Wrong one. Go up here. Okay. So I believe, I called it a summary sheet earlier. They call it an evaluation form. This is where all your ratings will be recorded for the 17 indicators. And so you can see where you were, the pasture, so on and so forth, the date you did it. And then there's an explanation of the codes that you can choose for the 17 indicators and the attributes. So let's go through a couple of these, and I'll show you real quick how this form works. It's pretty user friendly. Let's take water flow patterns, for example. You come over here, and this blank is a drop down, and so you can choose none to slight, slight to moderate, moderate, so on and so forth, and put your rating in right there. And then above it, you're going to see that if that particular indicator is applicable to one of the 3 attributes at the bottom, it'll list those attributes. So what this is telling us is water flow patterns are applicable to soil and site stability as well as hydrologic function. All right, so some indicators are applicable to 2, some are applicable to all 3, and like down here, this is only applicable to 1. But this will all make sense when we get to the bottom of the form. All right, so you choose your rating by each indicator. There's a place for comments over here on the right, as you can see. There's some blanks on the left-hand side where you can record things you measured in the field as you go down. Now I'm going to go down here to functional structural groups and explain this one for just a second, because you may run into this on other tools, and I want to explain the strategy with using something when they ask you to evaluate multiple things. So this is brand new in version 5. They basically broke up functional structural groups into 4 components, and you rate each component here. So like you can see the number of functional structural groups and a number of species within each group, you give it a rating. And you can see, and these first 3, we rated them none to slight, and then we rated the last one there slight to moderate. So what it does is it automatically assigns a rating over here. And generally what it's going to do is the worst rating that you chose essentially is what it's going to assign to that attribute. And so you might run into that on some other tools as well, maybe even in some cart questions if I recall correctly. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out there, so you just fill these out here for functional structural groups, and then it's going to automatically assign the worst one over here. You can see, like, if I call this one extreme, it should trump it. There you go. All right, so I'll go down here to the bottom, and I want to show you the attributes. And so what you can see here, soil and site stability is one of the 3 attributes we discussed above, and all these indicators auto-populated down here. So there was an S on indicator 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11 above. And this particular site might not be the best example because it was in really good shape. So we called it all none to slight. And then you go over here to your attribute rating and you choose what you think it is. Obviously, it's a slam dunk because everything applicable was in that category. So we called it none to slight. All right. And really, the other 2 attributes followed suit. There's a place where you can put your rationale as to your findings, but this one is very straightforward. Now, probably a more typical example, I'll pull up right here. We'll go down. This one had a lot of, fair amount of Chinese tallow and McCartney rose on it. So you can see on biotic integrity, we had some hits in the moderate category. We had some slight to moderate and none to slight for biotic integrity. And so, it's subjective now as to how you want to rate biotic integrity, because these indicators right here could be shotgunned all across this matrix. You may have some in extreme, some in none to slight, some in the middle, but you've got to make a decision on what to do. So in this particular case, we actually rated this one as moderate. Wow, that's over there. But we rated it as moderate, and then we just put a note in here. Since we had aggressive invasive species, they take a lot of attention. Conditions could change pretty rapidly. We think that that's a better representation of what's going on. There's moderate departure, and it warrants some attention. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. The final point I wanted to make with this tool is that it is intended to be used, as the authors indicated, as an early warning system, if you will. So the idea here is that if you're seeing a bunch of departure from the reference community on the left-hand side of these attributes, more than likely there's some resource concerns out there that would justify some further investigation, and you may need some management changes or potentially to plan some practices to address those to be able to bring them back. But it would be something, where you would look into it further and then work with that producer and see if they're willing to address it. That's kind of the idea of how to use this particular evaluation tool. But you're going to see range health mentioned a lot for one of the standard tools on rangeland. Hope it's helpful. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And I just want to thank the people on the next slide that helped put this thing together and provide materials and support. I appreciate it.